NDA, so we can't really talk about it, but I will say it, April 28th, we have a release date. And I will say that it's going to shake things up in Utah quite a bit. We just saw the episodes, the rough episodes, and even I was scandalized by some of it. I was like, oh no, my mother's going to be so mad. But it's actually really well done. Andrew Garfield plays a detective who is mainstream LDS discovering the homicide of Brenda Lashley for the first time. So his character is not in the book, but I will say that working with Andrew was such an incredible experience, and he was deeply thoughtful. He came to Utah and spent some time with Mormons. He even went to church. So we had him over for dinner, and he had a Mormon dinner, and he hated Jell-O salad. So if you ever meet him, tell him he's not a real Mormon. I wanted to thank people that came out yesterday. How many of you here were there yesterday? Okay, so yeah, for those who don't know, we toured Short Creek, and I'm really impressed with Wayne. He pronounces it the proper way, Short Creek. You can tell he's an official cricker. Short Creek, for those who don't know, is the fundamentalist town of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. And you know, as we got told by Shirley Draper yesterday, do not call it a polygamous town. It's a town with a polygamous history. The town is working really hard to change the narrative. A lot of people think that it's still FLDS, but I would say it's made up of folks like us, people who are leaving their religion. About 95% of the people in the town were fundamentalists, Mormon polygamists, maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, and now they're all practicing their Mormonism. And so what I would say about that town is, if a faith crisis were a town, it's Short Creek. And it's been a really healing thing in my own journey, and an educational thing in my own journey, to go and meet with these folks who have an adjacent experience than as I have had in the mainstream LDS church. And I think that the more that we can interact with folks who come out of different Mormon traditions, the better we do. And it's kind of the work that we do at Sunstone. We bring all the different Mormon traditions together and let people interact. And so what you do there is you're able to see your own problems and solutions from an outside perspective. And so sometimes if there's something too difficult or too painful, or you get defensive and you don't want to, can't confront it, you can see it in someone else's tradition, and that's a safer access point. And I don't want to get all Mormon-y about it, but I've really seen miracles in the way that the integration has happened. I've seen, fundamentalists, practicing fundamentalists meet with LGBT folks and people of color and have conversations that have been transformative into their own communities. So just a plug for Sunstone, that's what we do. We have a conference at the end of the summer every year, and you can come and interact with all the Mormon weirdos, including yourself. So, because Mormonism is so weird and crazy, and it's kind of nice to be with people who understand the same Mormon language. So yeah, thanks for coming out. If you go to Short Creek, feel free to go in the town. Terrell Musser was one of our contacts. He said you guys were very generous with him, so thank you for those who contributed. Like I said, he lives quite poor, and as do a lot of folks in town, and I think whatever you do him is going to really help his family. So thank you for that. And also thank you to Wayne for this community and for asking me to be here. He asked me in July, and then I put it in my calendar. I'm really embarrassed. It's an embarrassing story about me. And then the week that he texted me to follow up, I was studying prostitution in mining camps and brothels in the St. George area. And I get a text message that I don't know saying, we're going to talk about you speaking on Saturday. And I was like, oh no, what did I commit to talking about brothels? I was so confused. And so I had realized it was the invitation he had made to me back at Sunstone. So someday I'll come back and talk about horrors of southern Utah, but not today. Because boy, do I have stories. Okay, so I want to talk about Juanita Brooks because she's such an important part of Mormon history, of Utah history, of Western history, and especially this town. Is there anyone here that's not familiar with her story? No shame if not.
Oh, I am, kind of.
I mean, you probably know her name, you might know the arc of her story, but people get her confused all the time. So there were a few contemporaries of Juanita Brooks. Fawn Brody, who wrote No Man Knows My History, Maureen Whipple, who wrote The Giant Joshua, Dale Morgan, who did a lot of history, and Leonard Arrington sort of was mentored by Juanita Brooks. So sometimes their work gets conflated with her work. Juanita's most famous for writing a comprehensive history of the Mount Meadows massacre. So I'm going to talk about a brief history of her, and then I have a little special treat at the end if we have some time. It's a tour that I found that Juanita Brooks wrote in the 1940s to give of St. George. It was a tour that she wrote for the town of St. George, and I was able to find some of the original pictures as it would have been during the tour. So if we have time, we're going to talk about that, and then we can have questions at the end. So of course, this is Juanita Brooks. This is what she looks like. This is one of my favorite photos of her. Juanita was someone who didn't like her own face. She was very embarrassed about how she looked. She hated her nose. She most importantly hated her mouth. And I'll talk about that because that factors into her story. So she was born at the turn of the century, and her contemporary Dale Morgan, who was a genius historian, used to tell her that she was a remnant of the frontier, that she had the frontier right inside her. And so when I come to St. George now, especially studying this history, it's impossible for me to see St. George as a modern town. I'm sort of transported back, and to me, St. George is a ghost town. I'm lost in the ghosts of the past, and I really like it. If I get caught in the modern part of St. George, it's not that interesting to me, but when I see it through her eyes, I think it's such a fascinating town. So Juanita was born in Bunkerville. Are you familiar with Bunkerville? Home to our famous friendly brother and sisters, the Bundy family, our own homegrown domestic terrorist family. So her family are the Levitts. She comes from the Levitts. Her name is Juanita Levitt. She was born into the Levitt family, and I actually come from the Levitt line too. We share a common ancestor. Her grandfather, Dudley Levitt. And the Levitts settled in Bunkerville, and they even had their own little commune. It was called Levittsville for a while. But I was able to find pictures of their old meeting house, which is right over here, and this is the high school she would have went to. And I was actually impressed by the high school because it looks in some ways better than the high school does now. No shade on Bunkerville, but I don't understand why anyone would settle in Bunkerville. Sorry if you're from Bunkerville. So Juanita's story is really interesting. She was born turn of the century. Her story is fascinating because she grows up riding on horses and wagons and then talks about that transition to cars. So she has the apocryphal story that some of you might have heard in your own family. I definitely heard it from my own grandfather, that when they had to transition from horses to cars, the men who had ridden horses their whole lives to stop the car wouldn't push on the brake, they would yell, "Whoa!" and the car would run through the garage or whatever. That happened to Juanita. That happened to her father. I think she's beautiful, but like I said, she hated her face. She had a condition, and she pronounced it catera, and it meant that her mouth was open a little bit. Her front jaw was open a little bit below her bottom, so she was always breathing like this. And she said the women at church, the really study women in choir, she'd go up in ward choir, and the organist would slap her and say, "Shut that face, shut that face." And it just made her feel really bad about herself. But these are some pictures of her when she was young, and I just think they're beautiful. This is my favorite photo of her when she's young. She's right here on the right. She's traveled to California, to Berkeley for the first time. And that was a really transformative experience for her. She got to ride in a car all the way to California with some family members, and it blew her mind to be introduced to the academic world for the first time. This is Juanita this is her, and this is her mother, Mary Hafen, and all of her sisters. Now, Hafen is a name. I don't know if anyone descends from Hafens out here. Hafen was a Swiss colony that sort of, Brigham Young sent all this, Swiss people, the Danish people, the Swedish people, the German people into different colonies. And there was a Swiss colony in Santa Clara, and that's where Mary Hafen came from. And she was known for playing her guitar. She had this very, very high soprano. And Juanita Brooks hosted Ansel Adams and Dorothea Lange and took them on a tour through St. George. And Dorothea Lange actually took photos of Mary Hafen playing her guitar. And I found a YouTube video, you can look it up if you look really hard, of Mary Haven playing her guitar, and it's very sweet, it's very high-pitched, just old frontier country. It's remarkable. So Juanita Brooks was raised in Bunkerville. She was raised to take care of the horses. They called her Hen Levitt's boy because she dressed like a boy. Her job was to take care of the horses as her dad ran the mail from Milwaukee to Bunkerville. That was their job. He would come, she would take the horses that had just been run from town to town, take them to the stall, and bring out a new fresh pair of horses. So she played in the dirt. She liked to work on the farm. And it was hard for her to fit in with the girls in town. When she came to St. George, she was always very embarrassed. She talks about the first time she ever saw herself in a mirror. She was 8 years old, and she walked into the mirror and said, "Who was that ugly thing in the mirror?" and realized it was her. She felt such shame. And it's hard for me because her whole life she does carry this shame. She's always shamed about how she looks, about her dress, how she acts. But I, of course, just think she's lovely. You can tell she has a fun sense of humor here. This is her and her sister on the, I guess it's your left side. And this is her with some of her friends. This is her grandfather, Dudley Levitt. He was a prominent settler of southern Utah area. He was one of the leaders and one of the men involved in the Mountain Meadows massacre. So of some of the 8 prominent men, Dudley Levitt was one of them. Now the story goes in the family, and according to Dudley, that he would die saying, "I'm so glad no blood ever touched my hands," basically. Meaning, alluding to that he never killed anyone. And that's possible. His role in the massacre is interesting. He was in charge of scattering the cattle. So it's possible he didn't directly kill anyone, but it's probably unlikely. And Juanita would go to tell that story about her grandfather and about these men. It starts out with the story of Nephi Johnson. Have you heard of Nephi Johnson before? Anyone related to Nephi Johnson here? So Juanita Brooks is growing up, she's young, she's going out to school in Bunkerville, and she's going into what's called a normal school. Now before public schools, they had what are called normal schools, where the government on the East Coast basically said, we have all these rural towns out here that need teachers, and right now it's just whoever can read is teaching everyone else. So they're going to send teachers with training out to these rural areas and form a normal school. So Juanita is in a normal school with a woman from Columbia, and her name is Miss Connell. Miss Connell is this exotic fascination to Juanita. She's a non-Mormon. She even smokes sometimes. And Juanita is just enamored with her. And that's her teacher in the normal school. So Juanita is so influenced by Miss Connell, decides she wants to be a teacher too. So after she leaves her own school, she trains to become a normal school teacher, and now she's this young 18-year-old normal school teacher, and she goes to teach in Mesquite. And Nephi Johnson is a man that happens to be in the ward. Now, at the time she knew him, he looked like this. He was very old. I have a younger photo of him as well. Nephi Johnson's story is really tragic. He was early 1920, I'll have to look at my notes. He was young when the militia called him from his home in 1857. They said, the government is coming to get us, they're invading Salt Lake, we have to gather the militias and block all the passes, everybody get ready. So every local militia out here started running drills. They knew that the government was gonna come, they thought they were gonna put down the Mormons. That was the term heard over and over, and everybody was scared. So all the faithful men wanted to protect their towns, and Nephi was no different, so he gets ready to go. Over the course of a few days, they're brought out to a battle where they hear some immigrants are being attacked by Indians. Local Paiutes are said to have been attacking this immigrant train, and these militiamen are here to help protect them and help them pass through. Nephi Johnson is called, and he goes. What Nephi Johnson and many, many young men didn't know is that they were being called under false pretenses. They were actually being called to help kill immigrants, 120 innocent immigrants who were coming through the Old Spanish Trail, crossing into California. Now, I'm not going to go into the massacre history that much here, but basically, there's this rich wagon train coming through, and the plan was to steal their cattle, fleece them, set a lesson, and sort of blame it on Paiutes. Brigham Young, as part of his threats to the government, said, if you invade our territory, we're going to fight back. And not only that, but we have power to control all the Indians in the area. They do whatever we say. They're loyal to us. Of course, none of this is true. But Brigham Young has to make that happen. So Brigham Young, before the massacre, spends several weeks trying to meet with different chiefs. He tries to tell them we're in the same boat, we have the same enemy, the Maracats, the Americans, they're going to kill us. Our job is to put them down, and if you help us, you can take all this stuff. We'll split up some of the cattle, you can have all this stuff, and then we will protect you. The majority of the chiefs said, absolutely not. We have enough trouble as it is. Part of our trouble is you, and we don't want to help. And so Brigham Young is in a fix. So he sends some of his Indian agents to try to fix this. I'm being quite reductive, but John D. Lee happened to be working with the Indian farmers at Corn Creek, which was a farm that they had set up to teach Paiutes how to farm. So they send John D. Lee, and of course he wants to impress Brigham Young. He says, I can convince them, and they're able to round up, no one knows the exact number. Mormons will say up to 600 Paiutes, and Paiutes will say absolutely zero. And Nephi Johnson and others say there were anywhere from 40 to 200 that came. And when the Baker Fancher party are coming through Cedar City, they camp in Jacob Hamlin's property, which is known as Mountain Meadows. Jacob Hamlin had actually invited them to stay there, told them there was great water there. They didn't know they were being sort of lured into a trap. And all of a sudden they're being attacked by what they think are Indians. Now the Mormons and the Paiutes are lined up on a hill in front of this gulf. They send the Paiutes to run out first. And the Paiutes are like, what? I thought we were doing this together. You're sending our men out? So the Mormons say, look, we're protected by God. This is a true story. I can't believe that they did this. But they said, look, we're protected by God. Our white God protects us and will protect you too. And the Paiutes said, okay, that's true. Send your guys running out first. Mm-hmm. So they send 2 riders out, and miraculously they're not killed at all. So the Paiutes, according to Mormon sources, cheer and say, fine, you're right, we're gonna go. They send their riders out, and right away, some of their people get shot or killed. Pretty soon after a few raids, the Paiutes, and I'm saying Paiutes loosely because Paiutes deny any involvement. Will Bagley, historian of the massacre, thinks that it was probably what he called cell swords, some, maybe different fractured bands of Native Americans that needed money or food or something that were doing this for hire. But pretty soon people become upset and say, we're not doing this. This is not our fight. And so John D. Lee now has made a mess of things because he doesn't have an army, and his whole massacre thing is going wrong. And it's not just John D. Lee, there are several other men involved. And the story goes that he calls in this militia. Now the militias here, they think, Nephi Johnson thinks he's coming to help bury bodies of immigrants to help put this conflict down. When they start seeing Mormons dressed as Indians, they start getting confused. Now we know that the Mormon men dressed as Indians because Mormon sources say that, and Fancher survivors who either escaped and then were killed, or some of the children remember seeing white men washing paint from their faces. And that's why there's this controversy of how many Paiutes were actually there at all. We know that Mormon men deliberately tried to dress up as Indians, and we also know that Mormons armed whatever Paiutes were there with the weapons. So Nephi Johnson shows up as a young man, and when he finds out what's really happening and what they're really supposed to do, he's horrified. Part of his job is to take the horses. So of course Nephi, like most of the other participants in the massacre, say he never killed anyone. But back to Juanita's story, Juanita is now a school teacher, and Nephi Johnson sees that as someone who's important. She's educated. He's getting old, he seems haunted. So he asks if he can meet with the school teacher. He hits her up at church that Sunday, asks her if he can give her a patriarchal blessing. She's like, sure. I mean, we all know the sweet old man in our ward. She's like, yes, sir, whatever you need, put your hands on my head. So he does, and they form sort of a relationship. Now, the story goes, and it's actually a true story, it's backed up by multiple sources, that on his deathbed, Nephi calls for Juanita Brooks. He told her when he had given the patriarchal blessing, I have a story that I want you to write down. You're a school teacher. I need a school teacher to come write down my story. And of course, she's like, that's cute, old man. I already gave you the blessing. I got stuff to do. So she doesn't. And she would go on to regret that for the rest of his life because she's brought to his house when he's dying. And what she says, she's with her uncle, and she says, what's the matter with him? He looks haunted. And her uncle says, well, maybe he is. You know, he was at the massacre that day. And Juanita, her whole life, had heard little bits and pieces of this because of her grandfather, her own father. She remembers trying to bring it up with her dad once, and her dad was like, we don't talk about that. It's not something we talk about. And then Juanita, according to Juanita and other sources, Nephi Johnson sat up and cried, blood, 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 and then fell into a stupor and died shortly after, and those were his last words. So whatever happened to Nephi, he was definitely haunted. We know that through Juanita's work, she would end up finding several affidavits that Nephi had written to tell his side of the story. So that sort of is the catalyst to get her into writing history. She would go on to, this is her meeting with FBI, she did a lot of work with all kinds of things. So she would write in the 1950s, she published her first book on the massacre. 1961, she writes about John D. Lee because the Lee family is tired of John D. Lee being the only one responsible for the massacre. She writes tons of family histories, and I think the most important contribution that Juanita makes that people don't understand is that after she is a normal school teacher, she falls in love with a man named Ernest Pulsifer, and she gets married to Ernest. And he lives about a year and a half into their marriage before he dies of horrific throat cancer, terrible, painful throat cancer. He's a young kid, and they have one child, Ernest. And that's the boy that I showed you here. Let's see. So Juanita Brooks is widowed at a very, very young age, and she spends about a decade teaching, and she eventually goes on from a normal school teacher to teaching at Dixie College. She teaches English, and they really like her there, and she spends a decade as a widow, and she calls that being no man's land. She's a young woman, but she's also a widow, and in Mormonism, there's really not a script for that. If you're a widow, you're either an old woman, and if you're a young woman, you're married. And so she felt lonely. She didn't have friends, and this wasn't in a time when women were supposed to support themselves. So at first, she bounces back between her parents and her in-laws, who she doesn't get along with. And in the summer, she would go work. So one of the stories that I think is really important about Juanita that isn't told very often, I think because of the shame at the time, is one summer she goes with family to work in a gypsum camp, and we think it's Blue Diamond in Nevada. And there's a man there that is sexually assaulting all of the waitresses, including Juanita. So he's grabbed her a few times, who knows exactly what happened, but he corners her in a room at one point. She has to get a knife out and threaten her, and she says, damn your dirty heart, she says, and sort of chases him out. And unfortunately for Juanita, when she is called back to go home to Moapa, this same man is her wagon driver, takes her off the road, and he tries to rape her. We don't know if he does, how far he gets. Juanita claims that she's saved by the grace of God, a man that shows up to sort of help her, and she's able to go on, but her son was there for that. So those stories aren't really talked about in Juanita's life, but I think they go on to shape her story, because Juanita has a story about her father. Her own father told her a story about her sexuality, and I'm going to just read that because I think it's really fascinating. She talks about this story, and she remembers, she says she recalls her father saying that there was a young outsider who had come into a Mormon town and became so free with the girls that before long their fathers came to the bishop, each claiming that the young man should marry his daughter to save her good name. When he was called in the bishop's court, the young man was defiant. Was it his fault or the girls'? Or were the girls fools? Could he help it if they threw themselves at him? And Henry used that as an object lesson. She loved her father, he's a beloved father, but he told her, only fools get involved with men like that. And so, as I've been writing her biography, it's been interesting to see her her ideas on sexuality, because Juanita Brooks was very progressive in so many ways, but not on this. At Dixie State, she helped shame women who got pregnant, send them away, cover things up for them. Even when she gets remarried, so it's a decade later, she marries Will Brooks, who is quite older than her. He's the sheriff of the town. She writes in her diary, she doesn't like having sex. She's like, this is not for me. I don't know why we have to do this. It's depressing. It makes me feel miserable. And to me, the reason why I'm bringing this up is Juanita Brooks was very, very big on not hiding the history. And yet, Juanita Brooks burned three volumes of her own diaries, where she was very open, she says, about some of her feelings that she never wanted anyone to know. I found another case where she was collecting family histories, and there's a story of a man that was assaulted, it looks like by a Sunday school teacher at a young age, probably in the 1870s. Juanita Brooks deliberately leaves it out because she deems it as too sensitive. So I use that as a reminder to show the complexity of people and their bias, because Juanita, later on, she would go after Kate Carter of DUP, go after Joseph Fielding Smith for hiding things, for leaving uncomfortable things out. But I think everyone has a threshold, and probably because of Juanita's experiences, this is where hers are. So of course, I'll talk about that more in the biography. But Juanita Brooks was enamored with St. George, the culture of Southern Utah, and meant everything to her. The history that she told was for her people. She claimed Mormonism was her village. She lived it like it was a village. She knew everybody, and they knew her. And so that makes it all the more treacherous when she decides to start poking around about Mountain Meadows Massacre. When she starts talking about it, she comes from a generation, the grandchildren of the massacre participants. Now, the participants' children lived under the shame of it. If you were a massacre participant, you either got out of the country, most people fled out of Utah, or changed their names or went into hiding. But if you stayed here, you were stigmatized. So the Lee family, the Dame family, the Isaac Haight family, they all lived with this shame, and so they developed certain narratives around it. By the time Juanita comes around, the grandchildren are talking about, what the heck, why are our parents so messed up? Why are they kind of hiding this stuff? Let's talk about it. So Juanita decides to do that. And how she gets introduced to it is during the Great Depression in the 1930s, the government starts the Public Works Project, where they hire a bunch of artists, historians, blue-collar workers to do projects all over America. And one of them is a historical project, and Juanita is hired to collect pioneer diaries. One of my favorite parts about her life is she enlists all the women in her Relief Society, and they go all throughout southern Utah. They check attics and basements and trunks. There's stories of them pulling up their skirts and walking through muddy, flooded roads to gather these diaries, and they transcribed over 450 pioneer diaries that they found. And that might not sound like a big deal, but I'm telling you, everything we know about our Mormon frontier past comes from those diaries. And now they're in the Library of Congress, or in Huntington Library, they're in every footnote everywhere. And Juanita Brooks sat for hundreds of hours and transcribed old diaries onto her typewriter. And it's just, that alone should make her one of the greatest Western historians of all time. That she was prolific in doing that, and she also was able to employ these women who couldn't feed their families otherwise. In the 1930s, there were laws that barred married women from working because it took jobs away from men. And so if your husband was a drunk, or if he didn't make any money, or if he had abandoned you, a lot of women had literally no way to feed their family. Juanita Brooks saw this need, and she found out a way to employ these women, and she employed a lot of women and helped them through the Great Depression. The other thing I'll say about her before I go to her tour, and we were talking about this the other day, Juanita Brooks didn't even get married until she was about 40. Now when we think of Juanita Brooks as this historian, we think like she'd been doing this her whole life. She didn't even start becoming a good historian, a prolific, prominent historian, until she was in her 50s. So her career started basically at 50. You could say it started at 40, but she starts publishing at 50. Her best work, some of her most important work, is done at 50 and 60 and 70 years old. So to me, as a woman, that's so inspiring of just like so much that's ahead. There's so much. Did I lose it? Can you still hear me? Even the microphone is tired of me. Oh, it's just me to the priesthood. Thank you. And then he put the oil on the microphone. Yeah, to me, Juanita Brooks is so important because not only did she tell these stories of the past, but she collected history, and she did it in a way that benefited the community. Juanita Brooks was about the work always. It was never about just Juanita Brooks. There are hundreds and hundreds of letters of her giving free labor and time, sending historical records to people. She was poor her whole life. She wasn't paid enough for her work. To her, it was truly about the heritage and about the people and the history. And I think that's pretty inspiring. I think she was underestimated at every turn, to be perfectly honest. I think Leonard Arrington was completely sexist about her, if you read his diaries. She was a better historian than he was. There, I said it, Leonard Arrington. And he, you can definitely tell that because she was a woman, the way that she was treated, and it was disproportionate in history. And some say, according to Juanita, the only reason she was allowed to do this is because she was a widow for so long. So she wasn't a threat. If she was a single woman, it would have been a challenge for her to get as far as she did. And then when she married Sheriff Will Brooks, he had standing in the community, and that helped her as well. And I think that Juanita was sort of a feminist in the sense that that always bothered her. She would go on to write the history of the Jews. She worked for the government doing some surveys. She did the history of Green River. So all of that is to say that I'm going to go over her tour really quick, because in her papers there are so many unpublished manuscripts that Juanita never did anything with, that never saw the light of day. And to me, they're my favorite parts of Juanita, because you could tell they're the things she cares about and the things that she's interested in. So she wrote a tour of St. George. It was meant to be a bus tour. So I'm going to read it in her own words. And some of the stuff obviously has changed since the 1940s. I've seen some revisions where in the 60s she tried to update it, but she was hoping to start at the Macquarie DUP Museum. Have you guys been to the Macquarie DUP Museum? So that's where she starts out her tour. And it's titled Suggestions for a Guide Tour of St. George. So she starts with this. You are now in the heart of Utah's Dixie. Perhaps you notice the white D on the Black Ridge to the west, to the large word in Dixie on the bluff to the north. They are derived from the fact from the first settlements of this town, it has been known as Utah's Dixie because here alone in the entire state could cotton, sugarcane, and other semi-tropical plants be raised. The town was settled in 1861 by Brigham Young under direct supervision of Erastus Snow and George A. Smith. Several things are unique about it. In the first place, not a man who came in the first company did so because he wanted to. That is true, nobody wanted to come that way. He came because he was called. Most of the people who made up the company were established in Salt Lake City, successful in their trades or with their farms or orchards just beginning to bear and be profitable. To have left it all would have been hard, but to be asked to leave and to come to this place would be doubly hard. For this was the most uninviting section of the state, a barren waste inhabited only by lizards and the coyote. Its vegetation cactus, chaparral, and thorny mesquite trees, but they were called and they came, 300 families in all of them, and she makes notes, but she gets her numbers wrong all the time as she's updating her information. Another fact about the settlement here, that it was self-sustaining community, transplanted intact. With his customary wisdom and insight, Brigham Young called the right proportion of farmers, lumbermen, carpenters, masons, and tradesmen of all kinds, including a wheelwright, a tanner, a shoemaker, and a pottery maker. One man was even delegated to organize a choir and lead a band and help provide the settlers with suitable recreation, lest they become too discouraged in their conditions. This is perhaps the only world which was incorporated before there was a man on the ground which had applied for a post office before the settlers had even arrived or began their colonizing missions. where the cornerstone of the first public building was laid before the single individual home was ever erected. The settlers arrived in late November and early December of 1861. They located temporarily about 6 blocks east of here. William Carter, the man who plowed the first land in Salt Lake Valley with the same plow, enlarged the little spring and plowed a furrow down this valley. The wagons were lined up facing each other across the little ditch, and they remained during the winter while the site for the town was being surveyed by Israel Ivins. And then she points to the display in the Macquarie Museum. This display in the center of the room represents some of the activities during the first years. This cloth was made of the cotton grown here. The blanket on the other end is also locally made and dyed with native dyes. And this would have been the display that she was talking about. During the first year, 100,000 pounds of cotton were raised, and for many years, this was a profitable industry. Later, competition from the east brought cloth here cheaper than the people could produce it, so the raising of cotton was discontinued. The articles in the case also represent some of the first activities here, and then she talks about the candle industry and some of the other things that they were doing here. Okay. Here are some other things which may interest you. Notice the kind of tools that the workers used. Here's a picture of Joseph Wharton. Let's see. Joseph Wharton in his diary says, early in December, I had the privilege of delivering the first lecture, which was held in Asa Kelkin's big circus tent. I spoke on English grammar. And then here you see Juanita Brooks' humor. She says, I leave you to decide what kind of people these were who, in the midst of sagebrush and sand, would sit in a tent and listen to a lecture on English grammar. This is the picture of the man who led the first band and the orchestra. The man on the other side was called a little later to take care of the vocal work. He wrote the words and music to the now famous Christian song, Far, Far Away on Judea's Plains. I was thrilled last Christmas morning to hear this song broadcast from the great cathedral in London. He was so kind-hearted and literal that he actually spent months training his Mormon choir to sing the Catholic Mass in our tabernacle in order to please a Catholic father. Now, if you care to come outside and join us for the free bus tour, we will take you to see the home of Brigham Young, the Mormon Tabernacle, the Great White Temple, and other points of interest. Right this way, please. Before you leave the building, I should like to call your attention to the painting of Mrs. Hortense Macquarie Oldham, a granddaughter of the early mayor of St. George. Consequently, Juanita Brooks was her midwife that birthed Juanita Brooks was this woman's grandmother. Mary Macquarie, who was a prolific Scottish midwife who would sing little Scottish hymns as the baby was being born. And she delivered Juanita Brooks. Let's see. She's a granddaughter of the early mayor of St. George. This building is a gift from her to the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, erected at the cost of $17,500. Mrs. Oldham is now the manager of Bonwit Teller in New York City, the largest ladies' store in America. Now, I hope you will not be angry with me if I tell you some good things about the Mormon Church and about the success of some of its people. I do not do it to boast particularly, but I do want you to know them, and maybe you won't if I don't tell you. Did you know there's some people in the who's who of America from the Mormon Church than from any other group in proportion to its population? That's not true, but that's the case. That's how she would have understood it at the time. There are Mariner S. Eccles, Governor of the Federal Reserve, J. Reuben Clark. She didn't know that he was a jerk yet, but that's okay. Former Ambassador to Mexico and Undersecretary of State Harvey Fletcher. Famous scientist in the Bell Laboratories, Philo T. Farnsworth, who helped invent the television. So we've got that going for us, I guess. And I.A. Smoot, President of the Postmasters Association of America, elected to that office by men, not members of the church. And you know perhaps there are others. This building right to the right of us is the Washington County Courthouse, completed in 1872. The early taxes were paid in kind by molasses, cotton, and wool, being accepted in lieu of cash. The county assessor was also the collector, and his wage was a certain percent of what he collected, so you can understand that he was diligent in his work. The story is told of how the molasses was accepted for the taxes, traded at the factory for cotton, and this was in turn given to a printer for making the forms necessary to carry on all of the county business. You might be be interested to know that St. George ranks third in the sale of gasoline in the state of Utah. Perhaps you've noticed our wide streets, which I already covered. This is characteristic of Mormon towns. Mormons are very proud of our wide streets. We still are. To your left, you have the birthplace of Emma Lucy Gates. Let's see. This is fantastic. Have you guys heard of her before? Even though she came from one of the worst men in the state, she is the granddaughter of Brigham Young. She was fantastic. She says, Lucy is the songbird of Utah. She is sung in the great cities of America before the royalty of Europe. She was a famous opera singer that started her own opera company. You can see she's got like the Brigham Young jaw, poor thing. But she did go to Berlin. She was a beautiful entertainer, and so I put a lot of photos in here. That's her singing at Saltaire. She's just really fun. So she was born here. Her childhood home is here, and her mother, Susan Young Gates, did not approve of her daughter being famous or working. She thought she should be home having children. To the right is the Gardeners Club building, erected in 1869, just 3 years after the 1863, she has a typo, just 3 years after the pioneers arrived. This was the first building built to house the Civic Club of Utah. Here were held exhibits of seeds, roots, and cuttings in an attempt to find which were most suited for the soil and climate here. Through their efforts, alfalfa, almonds, and other fruits and vegetables were introduced into this section of the country. The first Jarvis grapes in America were grown here. George Jarvis, an English sailor, received 7 seeds and a letter from the islands of Malaga, and these seeds were grown the first Jarvis grapes, which are known throughout the entire country. To your left is the house of Anthony Ivins, well-known religious and political leader of Utah. He had just finished this fine home, and before he had a chance to enjoy living in it, he was called to Mexico to colonize and another section. He left the home in the hands of a caretaker and went, never returning to live here permanently. The house next is his father, Israel Ivins. You'll remember him as the man who surveyed the town site. And I will remember him as a very sexy, old-looking person. When I was looking at his photos, I was like, hello. I know it feels wrong, but so right. So he was a physician, and he was the first physician down here, and he had a little shop out of the back where you could get opium. So just first drug dealer, first physician, whatever you want to call it. Very handsome. We are now approaching the home of Brigham Young. I wish I might take you inside so you can see the lovely mantle and other fine handcrafted woodwork, but we must be satisfied to view the exterior. Notice the wide veranda and H-carved decorations on the pillars. For the 6 years during which the temple was under construction, Brigham Young spent at least 6 months of every year here in this winter home. The small building to the right is the first church office building in Utah. And then just ahead, you'll see the Deep Seed Cleaning Factory, which is formerly the old Opera House. The early settlers provided recreation in the form of theaters, dances, and operas. The first entertainment were held in the old social hall. And so she goes on to talk about the Deep Seeds and how they used to dance in this hall. And now it is the St. George Musical Theater and Art Museum. Let's skip ahead. This is the home of the woman who owned the DUP. I think it's called the Painted Lady now. We'll just go through that because I'm running out of time. She wonders what St. George would have looked like looking, over when you first came into town, and she talked about that a lot. She'd often go up the stairs by her home, by the sugar loaf, and look down and wonder what St. George used to look like. She says, this is the first lumber house ever built in St. George, because before they were all adobes. Juanita actually grew up in an adobe clay home. This is the first lumber house, which was built in St. George. This was made of square cut logs hauled 22 miles from Pine Valley Mountains. It was put together with wooden pins. The few nails under were square hand cut ones. The structure stands exactly as it did when it was completed, the same floors, the same old-fashioned latches. The only repair work that has been done is on the shingles. One of the pioneers mentions in his early diaries, it's the commodious new home of Melanchthon Burgess. And then she talks about the D.D. MacArthur home, the man who led the second company across the plains. Perhaps he should be classified as the first, as he arrived first at Immigration Canyon. He left the starting place second and passed the first company on the way. He waited at the mouth of Immigration Canyon until they should arrive so they could come into the valley first. Both groups, that's Brigham Young for you. Both groups were greeted by President Young, all the Mormon officials and brass band and great procession from the valley, and the first to make it to the journey across the plains intact. Right there, then she talks about Orson Pratt's house, which is now the Richard Bentley home, and then she talks about the Carnegie Library, which is no longer around. So that can kind of tell you where they're at. My understanding is they've taken the doors from the Carnegie Library and imported them to the new one. This is just a picture of what it would have looked like during her day, which I think is kind of fun. Oops. Then we go on to talk about the St. George Tabernacle, erected in 1853 to 1871. Architecturally, it is, 1883 to, 1863 to 1871. Architecturally, it's said to be the most perfect building in the valley and one of the finest in the state. It's built on native sandstone and every rock being carved. Notice the caps over the windows and doors, each one cut to fit. This little pane of glass in the windows were shipped by sailing vessels from the east around Cape Horn and up to San Bernardino and then across by mule teams. Each small pane cost $75 cents. Then she says, move inside. The self-supporting staircase is also hand-carved. The building held approximately 1,000 people, and the balcony was originally 3 feet higher than at present, but Brigham Young, on entering the building, said it was out of proportion and ordered it lower. Of course he did. And then she goes on to talk about the LDS Recreation Hall, where they would do the dances, the Dixie Junior College, which would end up being, it would go through to become the Dixie Academy and then eventually be part of the school. This is where Juanita Brooks institutes the first women's restroom, so thank goodness for that. And she talks about Erastus Snow. He was one of the main people settled here. She talks about his big house. This is the big house where he kept the wives he did like, and they ran sort of a hotel in it. And then she goes on to talk about the St. George Temple, and I'll just close with my own thoughts on the St. George Temple, because Juanita Brooks gives a nice history about it. But she talks about the sacrifice and hard work. These people came from all over southern Utah to dedicate whatever they had. So many hours, so many time and effort. And Brigham Young, when he came to tour, it was a few months before his death. He had gout. He was supposed to be carried in chairs, so people to carry him all around the temple. And what Brigham Young decided to do was criticize every single room and tell them what they did wrong. He hated, on the left, the tower was too short. He said that was something Gentiles would do. And so he made them fix it. And they didn't even think, they thought he was too sick to even talk, but he got up famously. Maybe if you grew up here, you've heard the story. He takes his cane and slams it on the pulpit and yells at everyone and tells them what a bad job they did. And the people kept the cane mark as a reminder of God's wrath as God's love, that Brigham Young came. And that's just, anyone that knows me knows I'm not a fan of Brigham Young for this reason. The saints loved that he came down and negged them and told them what a terrible job they did, and they felt so blessed by that. So, and that's Brigham Young. I mean, they sacrificed for years. They hauled rock. They filled the base with black shale that they had to mine. It's so much work. And Brigham came and literally yelled in his cranky chair about everything that they had done wrong. And they loved it. They loved it. They asked for more. So that's kind of how the St. George Temple went. But Juanita Brooks, if it were up to her, she would end her tour. We don't have her final thoughts, but she would end them on the work that we do in the temple and the baptisms for the dead. So anyway, I thought it would be fun just to have some of her own words here. If you have a chance to go through her papers or to see her statue, which is being dedicated at Dixie on Saturday, it's worth it. Juanita shaped everything in St. George in ways that you can't know. She was part of the Democratic Party, which is quite scandalous. There's a great story that when she has her baby with Will, their little baby is blonde. Will is a widower. He has 4 boys that are dark-haired. So she's taking her little blonde child down the street, and a Republican that hates their family because they're Democrats comes and says, well, that can't be Will's baby, is it? Tin sold her, whose baby's that? That's not Will's. And Juanita said, well, it sure as hell isn't yours. So I love that story. So she did a lot of work for the Democratic Party, a lot of work. She did a lot of work for the Teachers Association. She actually went to Short Creek during the 1953 raid. She went and defended the family. She was very opposed to the government breaking up families. And she wrote an article, several articles, some to the Salt Lake Tribune, and said, listen, when we talk about our grandparents running from the government and going and hiding out, it's told with a sparkle. Like, isn't that fun when they were in the underground and getting thrown in prison? What's the difference? And she did a lot of work. She helped some families reunite with their children, and those are some of the things you never hear about her. So hopefully you got to get introduced to Juanita a little bit more. She's become just so beloved to me. It's hard to not fall in love with her, and you're not supposed to do that as a biographer, but every biographer does, so thank gosh I'm not writing about Brigham Young. And this is her and her children that she had with Will. That's Will Brooks. He was also a beloved man. He was the sheriff for a long time, and then the postmaster of St. George for a really long time, and then they ran the Lee Motel. That is no longer here, but it was on Main Street. And Juanita Brooks' house is just right off Main Street. You can walk up right before the Sugarloaf, and it's a B&B. So that's all I got on Juanita Brooks, and hopefully it's taught you a little bit more about this town. Do we have any questions?
Oh, I'm going to start off.
Oh, okay.
Incidentally, I said a little prayer, and this mic works again now. So,
It always does. Didn't work for me.
So I'll pass this mic around for those who have a question. I'll ask a question first of all. Where do you get the passion and time to do all this research, Lindsey?
I don't sleep, and it's trauma. It's how I process my Mormon trauma, and I'm not joking. Part of it is I have an interest in it, but also I love Mormon history. It's the way that keeps me faithful to my community. I can no longer accept and believe a lot of the things that our church does or that our people do. And like Juanita, her story is used to either say that she was anti-Mormon or too Mormon. And so I resonate with that because Juanita actually rarely talks about her faith ever. And I've read so much of her writing. I've read her diaries, I've read her correspondence for decades. She loved her people. That's what connected her, and that's what I feel connected to and driven by. And so, to me, Mormonism is not just a faith or a religion or a belief, it's a heritage, for better or for worse. And so I'm really inspired and driven by connecting with my people. I felt such rejection, when I started podcasting and having for a time I lost my whole family, I lost my business, I lost my community, all my kids lost their friends, and this Mormon history has allowed me to keep it, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to pass this microphone around to whoever wants to ask a question. Start here.
Yeah, so it seems like I heard that she was a state relief society president and had a number of children, like, I don't know, 13 or 14, so would you clarify that? How many children did she have?
Okay, so she had one with her first husband. He died, her husband died when he was an infant. And so then she raised him until he was about 12. She marries into Will Brooks' family. He had 4 boys. And then together with Will, she has 4 more children. So they had 8 or 9. I say that because her oldest, Ernie, didn't really fit in with the family at first, so he went back to live with his grandparents in Bunkerville. And so it was kind of a transition. And she was active in the stake presidency for a while. When she was doing a lot of the public work stuff, the diary stuff, she was a really excited president, and she really mobilized in ways that I think are inspiring. Like, we talk about a lot of the harms of Mormonism. She really tried to mitigate those and amplify a lot of the good of Mormonism. That said, not the sexual part, like I talked about, but she was very good at mobilizing the women to do good for other women in the town. They were feeding people. They were, always doing. She got all the women to sew funeral clothes during the flu pandemic, and after all the stuff to bury people, to do temple clothes. So a lot of her work she was just busy all the time. And they said she didn't sleep very much either. And anyone that works and has young kids, you kind of understand that she would do her duties during the day, and then it was nighttime when everyone was leaving her alone that she could be up and working. So she really was sort of anxiously engaged all the time.
Yeah, Levi Peterson did a wonderful biography on Juanita. How is your biography going to enlarge on that?
I knew someone was going to ask me that. So Levi Peterson's biography is fantastic. It's very, very thorough. In fact, like so thorough, it's overwhelming. He definitely was thorough in her papers. You can tell he knows where she was on most dates, going here to there. I tried to cut out a lot of the minutia, the day-to-day stuff, and focus on some themes. And part of that is the sexuality. That was a really important thing. Levi touches on it a little bit, but you can tell it's delicate. Levi interviewed family members. And I think it's probably a thing that Juanita Brooks wouldn't want included in her story. But to me, as a woman and a Mormon woman, and especially from a certain generation, I think it's actually a really important story. I think it tells a story of Mormonism that, like, Meadows hadn't been told this idea of women having to grow up with sexual assault. Or Juanita Brooks' skinny dipping. I'm going to put a skinny dipping story in there. There's a part of her that makes her more human, and so I intend to add that. I also tend to expound on some of the obstacles she faced as a historian. As a woman, I'm hoping to talk about her conflict with Leonard Arrington, because I've always been a huge fan of Leonard Arrington. I'm such a fan of his work. He's such a good historian. But when I read their interactions, when I first started reading their interactions, I was a little bothered. He was younger than her and kind of smug. And then when I read his diaries, I was like, he is not very nice about her. So I'm going to include some of those barriers that I think that because she was a woman in a predominantly Mormon patriarchal town who were used to women as auxiliary, I'm going to talk about the challenges she had with that. And then I'm hoping to dispel some of the myths. There's sort of this narrative that she was marginalized by her church but always remained faithful. And I actually think it's kind of opposite. I think that the church was more supportive of her than we like to tell the story. And it's Juanita that sort of lost interest later on, especially in her Salt Lake years. She didn't like going to church. She said it, she turned down callings. She just didn't want to do it. She was faithful to the people in the community, but I think the politics and sort of the BS of Mormonism didn't interest her, if that makes sense.
Hi. Is this on? Is this on?
We need to restart someone quick.
Hello?
There's a button here, make sure you don't push that in.
Is it on now? Yeah. My name is Sandy Ames, and Juanita Brooks was my teacher. And I know I don't look that old. I'm actually 80 years old. So I had her for my English class, I think, because I was so enamored of Juanita Brooks that I'm not even sure that I realized I was in an English class. I was in Juanita Brooks' class is what I thought of. And so I talked to her a lot. I don't know why, but I knew there was something different and special about her as my teacher compared to the other Mormon teachers I had. Now, I wasn't Mormon. I'm not a Mormon, and I wasn't Mormon then. And I was a Democrat. And I somehow found out that she was a Democrat too. So I immediately formed a bond with her. And I was so enamored of her that I wished that she had taught me all my classes, was in all my other classes. But I can understand how you could be, or you can say all these wonderful stories about her, because that's how I was enamored of her too. And I only had her for one class for a couple of years. But I understand very much about Juanita Brooks, and I connected very much with Juanita Brooks to this day.
I will say, if you have talked to her or met her, I would love to talk to anyone that that knows her, I'm trying to do some oral interviews, so if you have any stories, I want to hear those. If you know Juanita Brooks, you need to talk to me, please.
Why am I under the impression that she was excommunicated? Was she excommunicated or not?
That's a large misconception. So part of it is that her contemporaries, when she goes to Columbia, she is open to a whole new world. She's in New York, she's with intellectuals. Her roommate is a secretary for a prominent, like, rich man on Wall Street, and they're having an affair, and she's his live-in mistress, and they're like happy with it. So Juanita's like, I can't believe people live this way, and she compares it to polygamy. She's like, everyone's mad at my grandpa, but like, my roommate's just like doing her thing, and everyone's happy with it. She meets, through Dale Morgan, she meets Fawn Brodie. And Fawn Brodie writes No Man Knows My History in 1945. And when that happens, Fawn Brodie is excommunicated quite publicly, and it has to do with Fawn Brodie's connection to the church hierarchy. Of course, she's a niece of David O'Mackey, and she's a Mackay, and she marries a Jew, which makes it even worse for the family. And she, of course, is talking about this history. And so Fawn and Dale and Juanita are writing back and forth, and Juanita is saying, am I going to get excommunicated? Do we think I am? And everyone's like, yes, you're going to be excommunicated. When Juanita publishes Mountain Meadows, it's radio silence. The church doesn't say anything. They don't respond. And that was almost worse for Juanita because of all this anticipation and all this stuff had happened to Fawn. They expected it. Nothing. And then she starts getting letters pouring in from all over. Thank you for this book. It's so important. She did have problems with the hierarchy, but I really think it's misplaced until the 60s. It's when she tries to write the biography of John D. Lee. She's writing the biography. She's paid to do it by the Lee family. They're so tired of the persecution and the stories about Lee being the only guy. And I sympathize. Lee was a black-hearted man. There's no doubt about it. I think sometimes Juanita is too sympathetic. But being his family, they were around people who were persecuting them. We're talking about real persecution. Kids getting beaten on playgrounds, people not doing business with the family, people not dating their kids because of it. And they're like, your grandpa was there too. You know, so Juanita really felt connected to that, and so she decides to write this biography of him. And as she's done that, she's already written the massacre book. And the family has been the Lee family has been petitioning for years to get Lee reinstated, his temple rights reinstated, because he was excommunicated right before his death, and that's been a huge source of pain to the family. So after Mountain Meadows, a book is written, it shows that Lee is not the only guy, and Juanita Brooks does that really well. It's not just his fault. So as she's about to publish this biography of Lee, the Lee family comes to her and says, Juanita, it's a miracle. You've done your job. The church is going to reinstate. They're putting him back on the records. They're having him rebaptized. Thank you, it's a miracle. And Juanita says, perfect. My book, my biography on Lee is going to print. That will make the perfect ending. And they said, absolutely not. No, wait, you can't tell anyone, because if you do, they'll retract it. And Juanita said, I have to put this in. This is like the history. And it's this back and forth. And her big sort of critical moment is she gets called to Arizona by a prominent Lee descendant. Some are a judge, the governor is there, all these state presidents. And you have to understand, and if you have a Mormon background, you know what it's like to be a woman in a room alone with all men. And I think Eddie Lee, two Lee women get to be there, and they are silent, they don't speak. And Juanita's in front of all these men, prominent men in power, and they are threatening her and coercing her. You can't put this in, they're demanding it. So Juanita Brooks does something that I think is the best thing of all time. She finally promises, she fights with them. She doesn't say like, okay, I'll do whatever you say. She fights with them. She finally decides, all right, I won't put it in the first edition. I promise not to put it in the first edition. So she prints the first edition, leaves it out, only makes 1,000 copies, gives it to the family, prints the second immediately after, and includes it. And of course, nothing ever happens. But yeah, the church never, in fact, she became pretty beloved in the church. That's the narrative I think that is kind of wrong about her. She became more disenchanted with them than I think they did with her. She's in every footnote and bookshelf of any prominent faithful Mormon historian now. They all revere her. And, you know, the Relief Society, General Relief Society liked her. She had a problem with Kate Carter at the DUP, but so say we all. Kate Carter burned things she didn't like, so.
Okay, thank you. That explains it. Appreciate it.
Probably more than you asked for, but.
So with her knowledge of Mount Meadows, she sounded so positive in the tour about Brigham Young. Can you talk on that, about how she felt about Brigham Young? Did she ever write about that?
Yeah, she has, I've thought about this a lot because two men she holds sort of in higher regard than I think that they deserve, John D. Lee and Brigham Young. And part of it, I think she adopted just the like cultural attitude that like, yeah, Brigham Young was a hard man, and he did a lot of mean, terrible things. But that's just how the men were back then. You know, that's kind of her attitude about a lot of it. I think that frontier machismo and violence was normalized for her as part of the rural ranching community that she grew up with. Her husband's family would go on a hunt every year. They were very, you know, like good old boys. Her husband Will was, by all accounts, delightful, gentle, fair, kind man. But I think for Juanita, Brigham Young was like the hard man that had to do things. That said, she went back and forth with BYU students, BYU professors on some of his flaws. So she was very aware of them, and she would never excuse them. But especially when she wrote this was you know before she gets into the history. You can definitely see later on in years she doesn't pull any punches. When she's writing back in the 60s, talking about civil rights stuff with a bunch of the people that were involved, she's very progressive. There was an issue where some Boy Scouts came to go to this rendezvous, and their train broke down, or can't remember all the details, but it was a troop of little black kids from out of state, and government officials refused to let them come to the rendezvous. And Juanita found out about it. She called the scoutmaster, and they found a way to keep these kids who were stuck on this train, put them in houses for the night till they could figure out what to do with them. So she was definitely more progressive for her time, but in some ways she was still old school Mormon, if that makes sense.
Hi, you spoke about her shame that she had in life. Was it more general than that, than just these facial features? I'm thinking the answer is yes, and I'm thinking about how often shame is associated with early trauma in life. And I'm wondering if you have knowledge or conjecture, whether it be sexual or otherwise, of things that had happened to her before she was about 8, I believe you quoted her writing.
Yeah, so I don't know about any sexual shame before she was young. I do know that her father was very, very much touted the narrative, as did everyone at that time in her community, that like women's virtue, if a woman was like assaulted, her virtue was gone, right? It's sort of the idea that we still struggle with. So Juanita absolutely believed that. I was really disappointed in my hero when I'm reading about how she dealt with the pregnancy of one of her students. And the way that she talked about her, they called her the California Rose, who's lost her bloom because too many of her petals have been picked. That's Juanita's language, not mine. And when you look at the woman she's talking about, it was a really tragic story. It looks like a woman who had probably been assaulted by multiple Mormon boys in college in an event, and then they blamed the girl. And Juanita blamed the girl and helped cover up her pregnancy. So I think that was it. Juanita had physical shame about the way she looked from a very early age. Part of it was this mouth thing that she had. Her teeth were crooked. Later on in life, she got dentures. And so her later years, she's got this, these are her new teeth. But for a long time, she had like this, I can't remember the name they call the tooth that sticks out. And so you can see that when we go back to some of her. Someone saying snaggletooth. That's what I'm thinking. I was like, that's not a very polite way to say it. She had a name similar like that she called it. And so she couldn't quite close her mouth. I do know that, you know, when she goes to St. George for the first time, she sees the Romney girls who are dressed really pretty with ribbons in their hair. She's wearing these big old boots. And which she said up until that point, she had never thought there was anything wrong with the way she looked, until she looked in the mirror and realized, oh, that's what I look like compared to these other girls. And that would haunt her for many, many, many years. Even as a young married woman to Will Brooks, the women of there was a social ladies club called the Athena Club, and she felt left out. Even when they invited her, she felt very out of place with the women in her community, and I think it just sort of speaks to just, you know, the dynamics of how women were competing with each other. See, here she's now married, but you can see her teeth stick out right here. She hated that about herself. She hated her dresses. When I talked to her daughter, Willa said, Mother never thought she looked beautiful. She was always saying her dresses were too ugly. She was always insecure about the way she looked. But I don't know, I think there's something very lovely about her. And obviously, I mean, she had boys when she was 16 or 17, her and her cousin Albert got too close, in fact, that both their parents said, like cousins can't marry each other, we don't do that anymore. And they had to separate them, and that was a hardship for her. But yeah, she, you know, she got along with everyone. One of my favorite things about her is she would go to the dances in Bunkerville or in St. George, and they used to take pieces of crepe paper, get it wet, and that's how they do their lipstick, that's how they dye their hair. They put butter in their hair to make it shiny, and on their shoes, which must have smelled awful. But she would talk about those things that she would do to get ready.
Are you going to be there Saturday for the event?
I'm trying to be. My issue is with custody with my kids and coming down both my kids, but I'm trying to be. I've got some interviews set up, so who's going to that?
I think it's you talk about
It'd be so good. The statue, they've cast a statue at Dixie, a great statue. Greg Prince helped with it, and it's going to be at Dixie, so.
Any other questions? Sure.
Curtis. My name's Curtis. Sixth generation prominent LDS of the church 10 years ago. I have a 21-year-old son, 19-year-old daughter, 15-year-old son. History is great. Without hurting anything, getting in trouble with Hulu or whatever. Could you tell this father, tell his daughter, who's 19, why she needs to know this? Am I making this so clear? I'm a very concerned father that has been involved in this. I was born into it, I didn't know that. And I want my daughter, she's perfect, but she hates herself. And I don't want to say much more because I have privacy. What would you say to me or anyone in here who has grandchildren or women who need to get a little bit of respect? My mother was actually the president of the diaries in the 1960s. And very LDS. My great-great-grandmother graduated from Utah State. What can I tell her my daughter? So she doesn't think that her daddy destroyed her. It's your turn. What can I say?
Is she out? Is your daughter out? Did you say she's no longer practicing? Or she isn't?
Her mother, my ex-wife, is the problem.
Well, I mean,
her mother's mother is the problem.
Could you repeat the question? Because could you say, because we couldn't hear it.
Yeah, he's talking about, he has a family and kids that he's concerned are still, you know, who grew up in this tradition and are, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, transitioned out. And just sort of, you're talking about the concerns and the harm that the church does to women, is that right?
In a nutshell, I have a 19-year-old daughter that I'm very concerned about. I am the 6th generation LDS. I left the church 10 years ago. My daughter's not out. I'm very concerned for her because of this history. What can I do to help my daughter get away from this without scaring her to death?
Well, if she watches Under the Banner of Heaven, that will have an impact, I promise you that. That's hard. I mean, you can't force people into any sort of thinking, but I do know that the history has been liberating to me and so many women. That's why I started Year of Polygamy. Hearing the stories of women in their own words, faithful women, talk about their faithful experiences, to me it felt safe, and it wasn't someone trying to pull or any agenda. When people think that they're being met with an agenda, especially an agenda that doesn't align with what they've been told their whole life, I think their first thing is to be defensive. And so history, good history, when it's written just as it is, doesn't do that. And so there's no defense that comes up that lets people, approach it on their own. So I'd recommend, if you can get her interested in her own history, have her do her own family history, have her take her faith seriously, have her take it at its word. And I think if you do that, it's inevitable that you're going to find things about it. But I mean, that's such a big question to answer, and I don't know that I can. But I will say that for me and for a lot of people that I know, the history liberated us. And even people who decided to stand, like Juanita, she was at a generation at a time where you just didn't leave the church. Utah was all Mormon everywhere. She was definitely liberated in herself. Juanita no longer felt harmed by the doctrine because she knew in her heart that it didn't align with the facts. So that's what I would say. I'm always a big proponent of therapy. I think everybody should get there. I think we should all be in therapy, and I think all of our children should be in therapy because there's a collective trauma that we're dealing with. There's generational trauma. And yeah, history of polygamy is a good place to start if you're a woman, I think. Anyone else?
Okay, no other questions? Thank you so much, Lindsey.